Before the roar of the 80s, there existed another world, a secretive kingdom built on whispers and absolute trust. It was the world of the Swans, elegant, powerful, and untouchable women whose private lives were more protected than fortresses. But that kingdom was blown apart from within, not by an enemy, but by their closest friend, the confidant to whom they had entrusted all their secrets, Truman Capote. With a single article in Esquire magazine, he weaponized their intimate confidences, exposing their deepest pains for the world to see. It was more than gossip. It was an act of social terrorism, leaving in its wake a ruin of ruined friendships and a horrifying lesson in the price of trust. And yet, amid the tense silence that followed that earthquake, a new decade had burst into existence, an era fueled by ambition, cocaine, and Wall Street cash. And at the epicenter of that whirlwind of glamour, a new kind of royalty had emerged. A young woman seemingly born for the flash, a living embodiment of the vision of a New York of power and uncompromising glamour. The press could not ignore her. They followed her every move, documented her every outfit, and in the end, crowned her the undisputed king, debut queen of the decade. Her name, Cornelia Guest. How could a girl, a second-generation swan born in the ashes of public betrayal, raised to fear exposure more than anything, become queen of an age that worshipped fame and made her very life a public spectacle? To understand Cornelia, you must first understand the world she was born into, a world that can be summed up in one word: Templeton. It wasn't just a house, it was a universe. A 155-acre estate in Old Westbury, Long Island. That was the life's work and sacred sanctuary of her mother, Lucy Douglas Cochran, known to the world and to history as C.Z. Guest. If America ever had its own aristocracy, its members lived in places like this. These were not the flashy mega mansions of today's new money. This was something else entirely. This was a statement of lineage, of quiet confidence, of a world set apart. CZ was the epitome of a certain kind of American aristocrat. Born into a prominent Boston Brahmin family, her pedigree was impeccable. Yet there was a fascinating, often overlooked, rebellious streak to her. Before settling into her role as a society grande dame, she had a brief but notable career as an actress, even appearing as a showgirl in the legendary Ziegfeld Follies. It was a hint of a more adventurous spirit that she would later channel into more socially acceptable pursuits. This wasn't a woman who was simply born to host dinner parties. She had an inner steel and a sense of theatricality that she would use to craft her own public image to perfection. Her ascent into the stratosphere of high society was solidified by her marriage in 1947 to Winston Frederick Churchill Guest. The name alone tells you almost everything you need to know. An heir to the Phipps steel fortune, Winston was the dashing embodiment of aristocratic masculinity. He was an international 10-goal polo champion, the highest possible ranking, and a distant cousin of Sir Winston Churchill himself. Their wedding was held at the Cuban estate of his friend, the author Ernest Hemingway. It was a union that combined pedigree, immense wealth, and a certain kind of sporty, worldly glamour. Together they created their masterpiece, Templeton. And it was there that CZ found her true calling. She was not just a socialite, she became one of America's most respected tastemakers. Her style, celebrated for its clean lines and understated simplicity, was a direct rebuke to the fussy fashions of the time. But her real passion, the one she poured her soul into, was horticulture. She transformed the grounds of Templeton into some of the most beautiful private gardens in America. This wasn't a hobby performed by a team of hired hands. It was a craft she mastered herself. She began a gardener's diary in 1978, which was later syndicated to hundreds of papers. She wrote it for about 25 years until her death in 2003. Gardening was for CZ about more than just flowers. It was about control, order, and the cultivation of beauty in a private, protected world. Her life, like her garden, was a carefully curated masterpiece. Everything at Templeton was just so. From the flowers in the vase to the guests at the dinner table, it was a life built on discipline, privacy, and an unspoken code of conduct that everyone in her circle understood implicitly. The first rule of this club: you never ever aired your dirty laundry in public. And into this perfectly ordered Eden, this hermetically sealed world of unspoken rules, came a serpent. A charming, witty, utterly brilliant serpent named Truman Capote. In the 1950s and 60s, Capote, fresh off the success of works like Breakfast at Tiffany's, wasn't just a writer. He was the ultimate social accessory. He was a master courtier, a modern-day jester who knew that his greatest talent wasn't just writing, but listening. For CZ and her circle of impossibly glamorous, powerful friends, women he famously nicknamed his Swans, he was everything. These were women like Babe Paley, the wife of the founder of CBS, William S. Paley, and a woman so legendarily beautiful and stylish that she was named to the International Best Dressed list 14 times before being elevated to its Hall of Fame. There was Slim Keith, a sharp-witted Californian who had married her way into British aristocracy. There was Gloria Guinness and Marella Agnelli, icons of European chic. These women were the queens of their universe. They were untouchable, unknowable, but not to Truman. To them, he was a confidant, a platonic husband who provided the emotional intimacy their powerful, often philandering real husbands did not. He was a gossip, a shoulder to cry on, a travel companion, and the most entertaining dinner guest you could ever imagine. He listened, rapt, to their stories of marital strife, their deepest insecurities, their heartbreaks. He saw the cracks in their perfect diamond facades. He knew who was having an affair, who was drinking too much, who was terrified of growing old. They told him everything. They adored him and they trusted him. Absolutely. It was their greatest mistake. For years, Capote had been talking about his magnum opus, a novel to be called Answered Prayers. It was to be his masterpiece, a Proustian epic that would expose the inner workings of the international jet set. The title itself was a chilling quote from St. Teresa of Avila. More tears are shed over answered prayers than unanswered ones. His friends, the Swans, waited for it with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, never truly believing he would turn his literary scalpel on them. And then, in the autumn of 1975, the bomb went off. Without warning his friends, Capote published a long excerpt from the novel in Esquire magazine. The chapter, titled La Côte Basque 1965, was not just an article. It was an act of social terrorism. It depicted a thinly veiled version of himself having lunch at that very restaurant with a character named Lady Ina Coolberth, a stand-in for his friend Slim Keith. And as they ate, they gossiped. But this was not just gossip. This was a meticulous, brutal vivisection of his closest friends. He laid bare the most intimate, humiliating secrets they had ever told him, changing the names just enough so that everyone, and he meant everyone in their rarefied circle, knew exactly who he was talking about. The details were devastating. He recounted the story of Anne Woodward, a society figure who had shot and killed her husband years earlier in a case officially ruled an accident, but which was widely rumored to be murder. In Capote's story, the character was a bigamist and a cold-blooded killer. The real Anne Woodward, who was already unstable and ostracized, got an advance copy of the magazine. Just days before it hit the newsstands, she died by suicide, taking a cyanide pill. Her mother-in-law was reported to have said, well, that's that. She shot my son, and Truman has murdered her. But the cruelest cut was reserved for his dearest friend, his ultimate swan, Babe Paley. He exposed the story of her husband, Bill Paley's sordid one-time affair with the wife of a New York governor, describing in graphic, humiliating detail how the tycoon had to wash the bedsheets himself to hide the evidence from his obsessively pristine wife. For a woman like Babe Paley, whose entire life was a performance of flawless perfection, this public unveiling of her husband's infidelity, and worse, his vulgarity, was an unbearable wound. It was a wound from which their friendship would never recover. When Bill Paley read the story, he is said to have looked at his wife and asked simply, how could he? The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Babe Paley never spoke to Truman again. When a mutual friend tried to pass the phone to her so he could apologize, she simply said, no, and the line went dead. That single word was an execution. Led by Babe and Slim Keith, the Swans excommunicated him. The iron gates of their world slammed shut. The invitation stopped. The phone went silent. For Truman Capote, a man who craved social acceptance more than air itself, it was a death sentence. He had committed the ultimate, unforgivable sin of their world. He hadn't just told secrets, he had printed them. He had held their trust in his hands, and he had crushed it for the sake of a few thousand words in a magazine. His life spiraled into a haze of alcohol and drugs, a long, slow public suicide that would end 9 years later. He never finished answered prayers, but here's the crucial, fascinating mystery at the heart of our story. One swan was spared. CZ Guest was not mentioned in La Côte Basque, 1965. Not a single word was written about her. Why? It's a question that has puzzled historians and biographers ever since. Was it because, as Capote himself once claimed, her life was simply too perfect? What would I have written about her? He asked an interviewer. That she's a perfect, happy woman? Or was it something deeper? Did he recognize in CZ a core of genuine kindness, a loyalty that he felt compelled, even in his most self-destructive moments, to honor? The reason remains a mystery, but the result is a fact. While her friends were reeling from the most public betrayal they had ever known, CZ remained CZ, and more remarkably, she remained Capote's friend. In an act of quiet but astonishing loyalty, she was one of the very few from that old world who refused to abandon him in his lonely exile. She stood by him until the very end. This act of grace, this strange exception in a story of utter devastation, placed the Guest family in a unique, almost surreal position. They had witnessed the apocalypse up close, but had emerged from the fallout shelter completely unscathed. And growing up in the quiet, tense atmosphere of this aftermath, in the beautiful but strangely isolated world of Templeton, was a young girl who saw it all. She saw the social casualties. She heard the hushed conversations. She learned from the sudden, permanent absence of old family friends. What happened when the sacred walls of privacy were breached? She was a child of the old world, a world of loyalty and discretion. But she was about to come of age in a brand new one, a world of media saturation and relentless exposure. She was born in 1963, a daughter of the age of innocence. But she would make her debut in a world that had lost its innocence forever. And the lessons learned from the ghost of Truman Capote would become her essential unspoken guide to survival. A world broken by betrayal, a social contract shattered. Into the quiet, tense aftermath of the Capote affair, a new generation was born, a generation that would inherit not only the wealth and the names of their parents, but also their scars, their warnings, and their hard-won wisdom. In 1963, CZ and Winston Guest welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Cornelia. She was born into an Eden, but it was a compromised Eden, a paradise whose inhabitants now knew, with chilling certainty, that serpents were real, and that sometimes they spoke with the voices of your dearest friends. Cornelia's childhood was, from the outside, a storybook fantasy. It was a life lived within the protective embrace of Templeton's 155 acres. This was not a suburban upbringing of neighborhood kids and school buses. It was a world unto itself, a private kingdom with its own rhythms and rules. Her days were not marked by the school bell, but by the rising and setting of the sun over the Long Island Sound. Her companions were not classmates, but a menagerie of beloved animals. There were the dogs, a constant, joyful presence, and of course, there were the horses. From the moment she could walk, Cornelia was an equestrian. Her father, the world-class polo player, instilled in her a deep love for the sport and a profound connection to these magnificent animals. Riding was not a hobby at Templeton. It was a language. It taught discipline, fearlessness, and a partnership built on trust and respect. While other children were learning their multiplication tables, Cornelia was learning to master a powerful 1,000-pound animal, to feel its movements, to anticipate its thoughts. This early education in the stables would shape her character in ways that no formal schooling ever could. It gave her a quiet confidence, a physical grace, and a deep-seated understanding of the nonverbal bonds of loyalty, a lesson that stood in stark contrast to the very verbal, very public betrayals of her parents' world. But the central figure in the universe of young Cornelia was, without question, her mother. CZ Guest was not a distant society mother who left the child rearing to nannies. She was a constant formative presence. Having crafted her own life into a work of art, she set about teaching her daughter the principles of that art. These were not the typical lessons a mother might teach. They were a master class in the creation and maintenance of a certain kind of life, a life of grace, discipline, and, above all, unbreachable poise. CZ taught Cornelia how to ride, how to garden, how to arrange flowers, how to set a table, how to write a thank you note, how to enter a room. Each of these was a lesson in aesthetics, but it was also a lesson in character. To arrange flowers was to understand balance and beauty. To write a proper note was to understand the importance of acknowledging others. To enter a room with confidence was to understand that you and you alone are the master of how the world perceives you. And woven through all of these lessons was the invisible thread of the Capote affair. CZ rarely spoke of it directly. It would have been against her code of discretion, but the event informed everything she taught her daughter about navigating the world. It was the cautionary tale that hummed beneath the surface of their conversations. When CZ advised Cornelia on friendship, she was implicitly teaching her to choose her confidants wisely. When she emphasized the importance of family and loyalty to one's own, she was reinforcing the walls of their private world against the potential invasions of outsiders. The most famous piece of advice CZ imparted was a simple yet profoundly powerful mantra: never complain, never explain. This was the core of her philosophy. It was a stoic creed that had carried CZ through the vicissitudes of her own life, and it was the primary shield she gave to her daughter. To complain was to show weakness, to cede power to circumstance. To explain was to justify your actions to a world that was not entitled to an explanation. It meant you met praise and criticism with the same elegant equanimity. You kept your own counsel. You maintained your private self unbreached and whole, no matter what storms raged in the public square. For a young woman who was destined to live a very public life, this was not just advice, it was an essential tool for survival. This idyllic, intensely private education existed in a strange and dazzling juxtaposition with the guests who passed through Templeton's doors. Cornelia's childhood was a surreal blend of pastoral simplicity and almost unimaginable glamour. One day she would be mucking out a stable. The next she would be making a polite curtsy to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who were her godparents. The former King of England and his wife were frequent visitors, relics of a lost world who brought with them an aura of history, scandal, and continental elegance. And then there was Andy Warhol, the pale, bewigged high priest of pop art, was a close family friend. He was a bridge for Cornelia, a link between her parents' staid aristocratic world and the vibrant, chaotic, and thrillingly modern world of art, celebrity, and downtown New York. Warhol was fascinated by the guests. To him, they were the ultimate American artifact, perfect, beautiful, and possessing a kind of authenticity he craved. He would visit Templeton for weekends, quietly observing, taking his iconic Polaroids. For Cornelia, he was not a fearsome art world legend. He was just Andy, a quiet, funny, almost shy man who saw the world through a different lens. He talked to her, he listened to her, and he photographed her. Through his eyes, she began to see herself not just as the daughter of CZ's guest, but as a personality in her own right, a character in the unfolding drama of contemporary culture. He was planting a seed of awareness that her life, her image, could be a form of art itself. This friendship would become her passport, her visa, into the world she was about to enter, a world that was 1,000,000 miles away from the manicured lawns of Templeton. As Cornelia grew into her teenage years, the question of her future began to loom. A traditional university education was never really on the cards. Her passions were horses and the life of the country, but the world had other plans for her. She was CZ Guest's daughter, beautiful, blonde, and possessing an innate sense of style and a charismatic energy that was impossible to ignore. The society columns were already beginning to buzz about her. The gravitational pull of New York City, of a public life, was becoming irresistible. The decision was made. Cornelia would make her debut, the debutante ball. Even by the early 1980s, it felt like a tradition from another century, a relic of a time when the daughters of the elite were formally presented to society as a signal of their availability for marriage. But the International Debutante Ball in New York was the pinnacle of this ritual, a gathering of the wealthiest and most well-connected families from around the globe. And in December of 1982, all eyes were on one debutante in particular. Cornelia's debut was not just another society event. It was a happening. The press descended in force. They weren't there just to photograph the spectacle. They were there for her. She was different from the other girls. While many of them looked nervous, overwhelmed by the weight of tradition and their heavy satin gowns, Cornelia looked radiant. She was utterly at ease, comfortable in her own skin, and she possessed a modern, photogenic quality that the cameras adored. She smiled, not a timid, polite smile, but a genuine, confident one. She had her mother's poise, but it was infused with a fresh, youthful energy that felt perfectly in tune with the new, optimistic, go-go spirit of the 1980s. The reaction was immediate and explosive. She was named Debutante of the Year in 1982, and later in 1986 she was dubbed Debutante of the Decade. The press crowned her unanimously the Debutante of the Decade. It was a catchy, alliterative title that perfectly captured her essence. It wasn't just a headline, it was a coronation. She had been officially anointed as the new face of American society. That night, In the glittering ballroom of the Waldorf, as the flashbulbs popped and the orchestra played, Cornelia Guest stood at a precipice. Behind her lay the quiet, protected world of Templeton, the lessons of her mother, the ghosts of the past. Before her lay everything, a world of fame, fashion, parties, and limitless possibilities. She had been launched, a perfect, beautiful ship, into the glittering, treacherous waters of public life. The doors to every exclusive party, every fashion show, every VIP room in New York were now wide open to her. The girl from the country was about to become the undisputed queen of the city. But as her mother knew all too well, to be lifted up so high by the press meant you were also vulnerable to a very, very long fall. The real test was just beginning. The coronation was complete. The title debutante of the decade was more than just a headline. It was a passport. Overnight, Cornelia Guest transformed from a well-bred young woman into a bona fide phenomenon. She had been formally presented to society, but it was the media that truly launched her into orbit. She was no longer just the heiress to Templeton. She was now the undisputed queen of a new, electrifying New York. And she didn't just step into this world, she dove in headfirst, embracing the chaos, the glamour, and the sheer, unadulterated velocity of it all. The 1980s was a decade that worshipped celebrity, and Cornelia became one of its primary deities. Her name was the ultimate key, unlocking every door. To have Cornelia Guest at your party was a signal that your event mattered. She possessed a unique and potent social currency. On one hand, she had the unimpeachable pedigree of old money, the legacy of the Guests and the Cochrans. On the other, she had a fresh, modern, accessible glamour that felt perfectly aligned with the aspirational spirit of the era. She was both an aristocrat and a pop culture icon, a walking, talking bridge between Park Avenue and the downtown art scene. This dual identity was thanks in large part to one person, her quiet, observant, and deeply influential friend, Andy Warhol. Their relationship, which had begun during his weekend visits to the country, now blossomed in the city. Cornelia became a fixture at the factory, Warhol's silver-painted studio that served as the nerve center of the downtown universe. To Warhol, Cornelia was the ultimate prize. He had always been obsessed with the rich, the beautiful, and the well-born. He called them the good people. In Cornelia, he found a direct link to that world, but one who was also young, fun, and willing to play in his sandbox of pop celebrity. She was a real-life version of the characters he put on canvas. For Cornelia, the friendship was equally valuable. Andy was her protector and her guide. He navigated her through the treacherous, often bizarre social landscape of the city. To be with Andy was to be at the absolute center of everything that was cool. He conferred upon her a kind of artistic credibility that money alone could not buy. He put her on the cover of his magazine Interview and featured her in his television shows. He was, in effect, her cultural godfather, validating her place not just in the society pages, but in the annals of pop culture itself. Life for Cornelia became a dizzying, 24/7 whirlwind of events. An average week was a blur of activity. A charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art on Monday, followed by a late-night dinner at Mr. Chow's. Tuesday might be a fashion show for a friend, like the designer Bill Blass, followed by an appearance at a Gallery O opening in Soho. The rest of the week would be filled with photo shoots, interviews, and, of course, the nightly pilgrimage to the clubs that were the true social heart of the city. These were not just dance halls. They were living theaters of the night. Places like the Palladium, designed by architect Arata Isozaki with interiors by famous artists, were where the uptown world of finance and society mixed freely with the downtown world of artists, musicians, and club kids. Here, on any given night, you might see Cornelia chatting with the artist Keith Haring by the bar, dancing near rock stars like David Bowie, or holding court in the VIP room with other young scions of famous families. She moved through this world with a preternatural ease, always smiling, always impeccably dressed, always ready for the camera. She was living a life that most people could only dream of, a fantasy of endless glamour and excitement. But beneath the glittering surface, a question began to form, both in the minds of the public and, more importantly, in her own. What was all of this for? What did she do? The title socialite, or it girl, while glamorous, was also inherently passive. It was an identity based on who you were, not what you accomplished. Cornelia was ambitious. She had inherited her parents' work ethic, and she was not content to be a mere ornament, a professional party guest for the rest of her life. She wanted something more. She wanted a career. And in the 1980s, for a beautiful young woman with a famous name, the most obvious path was Hollywood. She began to pursue acting with serious intent. She studied with the legendary acting coach Sandra Seacat. She started auditioning. And her name, as always, was both a blessing and a curse. It got her in the door. Agents and casting directors were certainly curious to meet the famous Cornelia Guest. But it also came with a heavy set of preconceived notions. Could this society princess, this debutante, actually act? Or was this just another rich girl's whim? She landed a series of roles throughout the late 80s and early 90s. She appeared alongside a young Julia Roberts and Liam Neeson in the rock and roll movie Satisfaction. She had guest spots on television shows like The Twilight Zone. She worked consistently, proving that she was serious about the craft. But breaking through to the next level was a constant struggle. The very fame that made her a household name also made it difficult for audiences and critics to see past the persona and accept her as a character. She was always in some way playing against the backdrop of her own celebrity. It was the gilded cage manifesting in a new way. The name opened the door, but it also threatened to keep her locked in the foyer, never quite allowed into the main room. This period was a complex and often frustrating balancing act. She was living a schizophrenic life. By night, she was the glamorous Cornelia Guest, photographed at premieres and parties. By day, she was a working actress, honing her craft, facing rejection, and trying to prove her worth in a notoriously tough industry. And the pressure was immense. The media, which had built her up into a goddess, was now watching her with a critical eye, waiting to see if she would succeed or fail. Every career move was scrutinized. Every outfit was judged. Every rumored romance was fodder for the gossip columns. Living under that kind of microscope is a difficult feat for anyone. But Cornelia had her mother's voice, her mother's creed, echoing in her ear. Never complain, never explain. So she didn't. To the world, she maintained the same effortless, smiling facade. She projected an image of a young woman who was having the time of her life, without a care in the world. She never spoke publicly about the challenges of her acting career, the loneliness of living in the public eye, or the exhaustion of constantly being on. She kept her own counsel, just as she had been taught. It was a masterful performance, one that required immense discipline, but it was a performance nonetheless. And then, in February of 1987, the music suddenly stopped. Andy Warhol, the quiet puppet master of the New York scene, died unexpectedly after a routine gallbladder surgery. His death was a profound shock. It was more than the loss of a friend for Cornelia. It was the end of an era. The man who had defined and documented the age, who had been the sun around which so much of her world orbited, was suddenly gone. His passing left a huge void in the cultural landscape of New York. and it served as a sobering punctuation mark at the end of a long, wild party. The death of Warhol, coupled with the stock market crash later that year, began to change the mood of the city. The unbridled, conspicuous consumption of the mid-'80s started to feel garish. A new, more sober sensibility was taking hold. The world in which Cornelia Guest had reigned as its undisputed princess was beginning to fade. The music was quieting down, the lights were coming up, and the party for a whole generation was starting to feel like it was over. For Cornelia, now in her late 20s, the identity of debutante of the decade was beginning to feel less like a crown and more like an old costume. The whirlwind had been thrilling, but it had also been disorienting. Now that it was slowing down, she was left with the most daunting question of all. What comes next? Every party, no matter how spectacular, must eventually end. For New York City and for Cornelia Guest, the dawn of the 1990s brought with it a collective cultural hangover. The dizzying decade-long carnival of excess was over. The stock market crash of '87 had tempered the city's speculative fever, and the death of Andy Warhol had robbed the downtown scene of its high priest. The mood had shifted. The unapologetic glamour of the Reagan years was giving way to the grunge-era introspection of a new decade. For a woman whose public identity had been so inextricably linked to the zeitgeist of the '80s, this was a moment of profound and unsettling quiet. The question that had been a whisper was now a roar. What comes next? Cornelia continued to pursue her acting career, moving for a time to Los Angeles and diligently working. She was a professional. She showed up on time. She knew her lines. She was dedicated to the craft. But the breakthrough into mainstream stardom remained elusive. The shadow of her persona as Cornelia Guest, the socialite, was a long one, and stepping out of it proved to be a formidable challenge. There comes a point in many lives, a moment of quiet honesty, where one must reassess the dream. It's not an admission of failure, but an act of profound maturity. To recognize that the path you thought was yours is leading somewhere else entirely. For Cornelia, this was a period of deep introspection. The external validation that had fueled her life for 10 years, the flashbulbs, the headlines, the invitations, had receded. She was now forced to look inward, to find a more stable, more authentic source of identity. The world had told her who she was for a decade. Now she had to figure it out for herself. During this search for a new footing, she was drawn back to the source of her original strength, back to the one place that had always been her anchor, Templeton, and the unwavering presence of her mother. As the chaotic tides of public life receded, the rhythms of her childhood home pulled her back. The city had been about becoming, but the country had always been about being. Templeton was her sanctuary, a place where she was not the debutante of the decade, but simply Cornelia. Here, alongside her mother, she reconnected with the values that had been instilled in her from birth. The discipline of gardening, the quiet companionship of the dogs, the simple, profound joy of a walk through the woods. Her relationship with CZ entered a new, deeper phase. It was no longer the dynamic of a mother instructing a daughter, but a partnership of two adult women who were also best friends. They were a self-contained unit, a fortress of two. CZ, with her stoic grace and pragmatic wisdom, provided the counsel Cornelia needed during this transitional period. She had seen the fickle nature of fame up close with the Capote disaster. She understood better than anyone that public adoration was a fleeting and dangerous thing. She encouraged Cornelia not to mourn the end of one chapter, but to begin writing the next on her own terms, based on her true passions. And it was at Templeton, far from the glare of the paparazzi, that Cornelia rediscovered what that passion truly was. It had been there all along, a constant, quiet thread running through her entire life. Her profound love for animals. This was not the casual affection of a pet owner. It was a deep, empathetic connection, a core part of her being that had been nurtured since her earliest days in the stables. And it was in this passion that she found her new purpose, a purpose that had nothing to do with fame, fashion, or society. It began, as most life-changing journeys do, with a single, impulsive act of compassion. Here is the story that marks the true turning point in her life, a story far more revealing than any gossip column mention. She heard about a miniature donkey that was scheduled to be euthanized. He was old, unwanted, and had run out of time. For most people, it would have been a sad, distant story. For Cornelia, it was an immediate call to action. She didn't hesitate. She didn't form a committee or make a donation. She got in her car, went to where the donkey was, and brought him home. She saved his life. She named him Madonna. That one act opened the floodgates of her heart. Saving Madonna wasn't just about saving an animal. It was about saving a part of herself. It was a declaration of what truly mattered to her. Soon, one rescued animal became 2, then 10, then more. Her home, the pristine grounds of her famous family, began to transform into an accidental sanctuary. She took in abandoned pot-bellied pigs, rescued dogs, horses destined for the slaughterhouse. These were the forgotten ones, the animals that society had deemed disposable. And in giving them a home, Cornelia was building a new home for herself, one founded not on pedigree or press clippings, but on unconditional love and service. This was a radical redefinition of her life. It was a quiet, private rebellion against the world of surfaces she had inhabited for so long. There were no cameras here, no red carpets. There was just the hard, messy, deeply rewarding work of caring for creatures who depended on her completely. She was no longer performing, she was nurturing, she was healing. And in the process, she was healing herself. This newfound sense of purpose began to ripple out into other areas of her life. She realized that relying on an acting career or the whims of public opinion was not a stable foundation. She needed to build something of her own, something that was hers from the ground up. Drawing on the lifetime of lessons from the world's most accomplished hostess, she did something both pragmatic and brilliantly symbolic. She decided she would go into business, but on her own terms and on her own timeline. After years of cementing her role as a dedicated activist, in the early 2000s, she officially turned her legacy into an enterprise. She launched a high-end, cruelty-free catering and event planning company. The logic was impeccable. The name Guest was synonymous with entertaining. For generations, it had meant the highest standard of hospitality. Cornelia took that inherited brand equity and turned it into her own enterprise. It was a masterful move. She was no longer just a guest at the party. She was the party. She followed this with other ventures, a line of vegan handbags, reflecting her commitment to animal welfare, and a range of other lifestyle products. She was becoming an entrepreneur, a brand builder, taking control of her own name and her own financial destiny. She was applying the discipline her mother had taught her in the garden to the world of commerce. She was planting seeds, nurturing them, and watching them grow into a sustainable future. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, a new Cornelia Guest had fully emerged. The transformation was complete. The debutante of the decade was now a dedicated animal activist and a savvy businesswoman. She had successfully navigated the treacherous journey from being a celebrated object to being the subject of her own life. She had built an identity on a foundation of substance, compassion, and hard work. She had found her footing, and it was this strength, this newfound sense of self, that she would need more than ever as she prepared to face the most profound loss of her life. For years, her anchor, her best friend, her mother CZ, had been battling cancer. Cornelia, in the ultimate act of love and loyalty, became her full-time caregiver. The glitz and glamour of her old life were a distant memory. Her world shrank to the quiet rooms of Templeton, her focus singular, to care for the woman who had given her everything. It was a period of quiet, private, exhausting devotion, a reversal of roles where the daughter now nurtured the mother. In the autumn of 2003, C.Z. Guest passed away at the age of 83. She died at home, surrounded by the garden she had so lovingly cultivated, with her devoted daughter by her side. For Cornelia, the loss was seismic. It was the felling of the great oak that had sheltered her entire life. The woman who had been her guide, her confidant, her role model, and her fiercest protector was gone. She had successfully navigated the treacherous world of fame. She had built a new life of purpose for herself, but now she faced the ultimate challenge: to continue on alone without her anchor in the world. The last swan had taken flight. A world without its anchor, a garden without its gardener. The death of C.Z. Guest in 2003 was more than the passing of a society icon. It was the closing of a book on a certain kind of American life. For Cornelia, the loss was seismic, a fundamental altering of her personal landscape. The woman who had been her guide, her confidant, her North Star, was gone. For 40 years, she had been C.Z. Guest's daughter. Now, in the profound silence left by her mother's absence, she had to face the world simply and completely as herself. Grief is a private country, but for Cornelia it came with a very public set of responsibilities. She was now the custodian of a formidable legacy. There was the estate, Templeton, a living monument to her mother's passion. There were the archives, the correspondence, the history. She was no longer just a resident of her mother's world. She was its sole inheritor and protector. Many people in her position might have buckled under the weight of such a legacy or sought to escape it. But Cornelia, armed with a lifetime of her mother's wisdom, did what she had always been taught to do. She carried on with quiet dignity and immense strength. This period, far from the public eye, was perhaps her most formative. It was a time of consolidation. She managed the difficult task of sorting through her mother's life, of preserving her memory, while also beginning to gently reshape the estate to reflect her own life and passions. The informal animal sanctuary she had started became a more permanent fixture, a living tribute to the compassion that had defined her own journey. In a way, taking care of her mother's legacy was the final lesson in her long apprenticeship. It required all the discipline, grace, and resilience that CZ had instilled in her. She was no longer living under her mother's protection. She was now embodying her mother's strength. Having navigated her private grief, she re-emerged into public life, but on entirely new terms. The transformation that had begun in the 1990s now reached its full expression. She was no longer a subject of the gossip columns or a fixture of the party scene. She was now a formidable advocate, an entrepreneur, and a philanthropist who had found her voice and her mission. Her work for animal welfare became the central organizing principle of her public life. She founded her own nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting animal rescue and advocacy. She became a national spokesperson for the Humane Society, lending her famous name and her powerful voice to the cause of the voiceless. This was not the dilettantism of a bored socialite. This was the work of a lifetime. Her compassion, once expressed by rescuing a single donkey, was now channeled into a national movement. She had successfully taken the platform her birth had given her and repurposed it for a cause greater than herself. The name Cornelia Guest, once synonymous with debutante balls in Studio 54, was now synonymous with animal rights. It was the ultimate and most meaningful rebranding of her life. This journey from it girl to advocate is more than just a compelling personal story. It holds within it the key to understanding a tectonic shift in our culture. Cornelia Guest stands as a crucial and perhaps unique bridge figure between two vastly different worlds of fame. Her mother's generation, the Swans, represented the final chapter of an old world aristocracy. Their fame was built on mystique, on privacy, on inaccessibility. They were famous within a very small, very exclusive circle. Their power came from the fact that the public knew almost nothing about their real lives. Truman Capote's great crime was that he violated this code, dragging their private lives into the public square. Cornelia came of age at the precise moment that this entire paradigm was being inverted. The 1980s saw the birth of modern celebrity culture, a culture that was no longer based on mystique but on exposure. Fame became a relentless 24/7 performance for the media. Cornelia was a prototype of this new celebrity. She was one of the first to have her life chronicled in real time by the paparazzi and the gossip columns. In this, she was a direct forerunner of the generation of Paris Hilton, of the Kardashians, of the reality television stars and social media influencers who would follow. She walked the path first, but here is what makes her story so significant and so different. While many who followed that path chose to lean into the spectacle, to build empires based on the monetization of their private lives, Cornelia ultimately made a different choice. After a decade of living in the full glare of the flashbulb, she chose to deliberately step away from the center of the storm. She chose purpose over publicity. She chose to build a life of substance rather than one of perpetual spectacle. Her story serves as both a blueprint for modern celebrity and a cautionary tale about its potential emptiness. She understood, perhaps because of the chilling lesson of Capote's ghost, that a life lived entirely for the public eye is a life that is not truly your own. And so we return to the beginning, to the ghost of a brilliant, tragic man and the betrayal that echoed through generations. The story of the Swans and Capote was a story about the loss of narrative. These powerful women who had so carefully controlled their own images had their stories stolen from them, twisted into a grotesque caricature for public consumption. This was the lesson that hung in the air at Templeton throughout Cornelia's childhood. Your story is the most valuable thing you own, and it is also the most vulnerable. Cornelia's entire life can be seen as a long, determined, and ultimately successful effort to control her own narrative. The world tried to write a story for her. In the 80s, it was the story of the perfect, glamorous party girl. For a time, she played the part. But in the end, she picked up the pen herself. She wrote a different story. A story about a woman who loved animals, who built her own businesses, who cared for her mother, who found a cause that mattered to her. She didn't let the media define her. She defined herself. In this, she achieved the one thing that had been stolen from her mother's friends, a final, unassailable victory over the ghosts of the past. In the end, the fairy tale of Cornelia Guest isn't the one the press wrote for her in 1982. It isn't a story of a princess in a gilded cage or a party that never ended. It's a quieter, more profound, and far more interesting story of resilience. She was born into the long shadow of a legendary mother and the chilling aftermath of a great betrayal. She was crowned the queen of a decade defined by glittering surfaces and fleeting fame. She could have easily become a casualty of that world, a nostalgic footnote in the history of New York society, but she didn't. Instead, she embarked on a long, patient journey of self-discovery. She navigated the treacherous waters of celebrity with a grace that was her birthright and a strength that was all her own. She discovered that true elegance isn't found in a couture gown or at a VIP table, but in character, compassion, and purpose. Cornelia Guest's life is a testament to the enduring power of adaptation. It is a reminder that we are not defined by the circumstances of our birth or the expectations of others. Her story teaches us that the most courageous act is not to live up to a famous name, but to quietly, determinedly build a meaningful life of one's own. She didn't just escape the shadow she was born into. She learned how to step out of it and find her own patch of sunlight on her own terms.